You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 361 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm covering the immigration dispute between the U.S. and Mexico. I have some news on Israel and Palestine, including the severe mistreatment of a 5-year-old girl with cancer. And I have some big updates on the U.S.-Turkey relationship as Turkey moves closer to buying the S-400 missile system from Russia. Please take the time to share the show or recommend it to a friend. Best place to find the show online is at the Libertarian Institute, where the show and my daily news roundup are featured in the right-hand column of the homepage. I also want to mention the Patreon stuff. I've done an awful job of keeping up with the commitments I try to make on that. I'm really not putting out any bonus episodes. So I'm going to try to do something a little different where I just do it once a month, $5 on Patreon. You get in, ask me anything live stream. We'll see how much interest there is, and if people are signing on and like it, you know, I could extend it or do a couple a month or something like that. Honestly, I've just kind of been concerned if I go this route, nobody's going to show up. I end up talking to myself for an hour. But, yeah, so my apologies to my patrons, you know, who have been donating to me, hoping to hear me do some bonus shows once a month, and I just haven't been able to keep up with that. You know, I'm pretty busy with, got to work a day job still, plus the podcast and the news roundups, and immersionnews.com, which is what you could check out. So anybody who donates to me on Patreon, really you're supporting all my work, not just this show. A lot of stuff I do in covering things outside just foreign policy, but also police day as well. And then I'll have that Ask Me Anything for people to come on and just, ask me whatever the hell they want. Yeah, so find all that at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, on to the news for today. Rand Paul put out this statement that I thought was interesting. It ran in the Washington Examiner, which I think is a little bit of a neocon website. I believe there was a split with maybe the kind of Bill Kristol faction that now has a publication called The Bulwark or something like that. So watch out for that one. You know, that's where a bunch of neocons are now. But anyways, we got the Washington Examiner here, and it puts out a statement by Rand Paul saying that the president gave a direct order to remove John Brennan's security clearance, and it never happened because of deep state actors. One thing notable about this, to me at least, is that Rand Paul used the term deep state and everything, and kind of saying that they've subverted Donald Trump's authority. And it's a big claim from a senator. It should be a real wake-up call, and maybe calls for the Senate to carry out something like a church committee and start to really dig into what the intelligence agencies are doing behind the backs of the elected officials, and not even just the intelligence agencies, career bureaucrats at places like the State Department, not the FBI, but the rest of the Justice Department. There's a lot of career people at all these places who all have a lot of influence and institutional abilities to maybe not follow the order of a president. Now, that's not to say that every order of every president should be followed. I mean, I think half the time, at least, Donald Trump tells people to do things. They should be giving him the middle finger and saying, hell no, and walking off the job in protest saying, there's no way I'm going to do anything immoral. But, that's not going to happen. And in this case, I think it was the worst decision. This is one of the few of Donald Trump's that should have been followed here. And, John Brennan's security clearance has been revoked. Why this is also important, of course, is that John Brennan, with his security clearance, can know all these things that the American people can't know. And so then he could go on CNN and make ridiculous claims about Russiagate, him feeling sure that Donald Trump's a traitor and that he conspired with the Russians to win the 2016 election. And then when anybody asks him for evidence, because nobody has ever seen any, he could say, well, I have the security clearance, and what that means is that legally I can know, but you can't. Now, this should only be a minor problem because realistically, CNN and all the other news networks should be saying, well, if you can't show me any evidence, sir, I'm not sure if I could believe your claim. And if you really are saying this is something that is as important as, the sitting president of the United States winning an election at behest of a foreign power, well, you should just leak that evidence to the American people and trust that, what's going to happen needs to be happening, because you're talking about some high level treason there, John Brennan. And so that's never said, it's never held, his feet are never held to the fire, but his statements are taken as truth. If John Brennan says Donald Trump's a traitor, then Donald Trump's a traitor. And that's how a lot of people feel. That's how the mainstream media, especially in this case, the liberal networks now, look, Fox and the rest of them have all their problems too, and they get a lot of things wrong. This just doesn't happen to be one of them. And so revoking that security clearance takes away John Brennan's ability to say that. And then it really, first of all, I'm sure it's going to hurt his pocket, right? Because then he's no longer quite so valuable to all these networks like CNN, who want him on there to make that claim, right? That's the point. That's what Rachel Maddow wants her guests to say when she asks them those questions. And it'll just make his word, less valuable, because to a lot of people, having a security clearance is this really high value sign that says, we as a people trust you to be the most trustworthy. So a big thumbs up. Good job to Rand Paul. A congressman you can't give a thumbs up to is Duncan Hunter Jr. He was on a podcast talking about a U.S. soldier who murdered people in Iraq. And it's just clear murder. He's admitted that he's fired into crowds of people. And I think there's one case where he killed a 22-year-old man, just in a straight up murder that's admitted. Stabbed the guy in the back, didn't have to kill him, but killed him anyways. So he's up for charges on this. And I think there's some controversy around it because maybe the president was going to pardon him or, look to make sure he didn't face justice. But then not Spencer Gallagher, in this case is Representative Duncan Hunter Jr. gives his take on it, which is that when he was a Marine in Iraq, he's sure that his unit killed hundreds of civilians, or I think he said probably, not sure, but he thinks his unit may have killed hundreds of civilians when, fighting these battles. Now, I find it very interesting here that Duncan Hunter equates stabbing a man to death with, we're fighting a war against people that we think are really, really bad people. The kind of people that if we let them live, they're eventually going to make their way to the United States and kill us. And we think they're in House A, and we decide to fire an artillery shell against House A. And it turns out that we miscalculated and it hits House B and 5 innocent people die. Not that either of them is a horrific crime, but certainly the justice system treats one a lot different from the other. And there's certainly, I think to me, there's one group of people, or one guy I definitely don't want on the streets, the guy that stabbed somebody to death and fired into a crowd of people, versus, people who are told from the time they were born that the great American empire goes around the world. And as an American soldier, you are part of that mission, and, you are in an honorable and moral role, and your leaders have given you the best guidance and direction that you ever need. And so everything you do is the right thing to do. Everything you're ordered to do is the right thing to do. And that's how the system works. And so somebody, kind of growing up in that system, I really understand how they get there and maybe have killed some civilians, during the course of their duty. And to me, that's far different from a sociopath like this guy who's going around just murdering people for fun. Now, what bothers me most about Duncan Hunter's statement is that he seems to want to equate what he did with what Spencer did rather than, we were just doing the best job we can. It's pretty clear from, that war criminal's own statements that he was certainly committing war crimes and was not troubled by it whatsoever. You think this would be one of those cases where the military would stand up and be some of the most critical people towards this soldier because what he did was terrible and it gives them a bad name rather than, just trying to do the best they can to bring peace and freedom to people. Anyways, so everybody, whenever you're, watching TV, you see Duncan Hunter come on, know that guy is an absolute nut job who likes to, pretend his military service was, the honorable, noble thing. And that's the same thing as some guy running around murdering people. It's a very strange position. But I guess it's, just giving enough cognitive dissonance to the Republicans to bat this decision by President Trump. All right. So some updates on Mexico here. And as always, I don't like to get too into the immigration debate, but this is now kind of dealing with geopolitics a little bit. So I'll talk about it here. Trump threatened to put 5% tariffs on Mexican imports. people went absolutely crazy. When I first read it, I was like, wow, Trump, I thought, dug himself quite a hole there. I couldn't imagine him actually putting the tariffs on the Mexican imports, especially since he recently worked out all of this U.S., Canada, Mexico trade deal, NAFTA renegotiation thing. Why destroy everything, just for this immigration problem to put on 5% tariffs? The way I'm looking at this, Mexico, in response, decides to deploy 6,000 National Guard troops to the southern border. Now, for all I know, this is a planned rotation kind of thing, and they're not really adding any troops or any soldiers, border police to the southern border, or maybe they're actually sending 6,000 people down there to work. Now, at least by land, the Mexican border with Guatemala certainly isn't like the U.S. border with Mexico, being, wild and untamed, kind of unpatrollable. It may be that if you send 6,000 people down there, you pretty much link arms and just turn anybody who comes around. Now, I'm guessing there's all kinds of human smuggling and way things get through that border to bypass, these national security. And Mexico could not be that interested in border enforcement. So they could certainly send them to the border, but then they could have those guys down there doing anything or absolutely nothing at all. Now, Trump took this and billed it as a victory. He did say, I believe, that he said there was more like Mexican concessions to come. So maybe they're going to maybe do something else that'll make the Trump and U.S. happy here. But Trump's trying to build as a victory. In this case, it seems to me that the mainstream media may be a little bit more right in saying that it's not all that much of one. But on this may be something that time will tell. If Mexico starts turning around everybody coming through Guatemala and suddenly, the migrant caravans and the asylum seekers stop coming to the U.S. southern border, then maybe it did work and this was a good move by Trump. Overall, whether this is effective or not, better to not have the tariffs than have them put on. All right, so a U.S. and Russian warship nearly collided in the Philippine Sea. I'm not sure how, concerned everybody should have been. When you see the video, it certainly looks like the ships are going to run into each other, and it kind of does make sense to me why people have this dramatic reaction, like, oh my God, the ships almost collided. I've never talked to, somebody who's been on a battleship before, and I think you had to talk to somebody like that to actually understand how close these ships came together. Now, the U.S. blamed Russia blamed the U.S., and then there's video out there of what happened. So what we know from the Moon of Alabama blog, which is absolutely fantastic, and I'll link to that on the show notes page, is that this Russian ship and the American ship were on paths to collide with each other with the directions that they were going. The U.S. says that they were attempting to, retrieve some kind of helicopter, land it back on the ship. The Russians were doing whatever the Russians were doing. What Bernard does at Moon of Alabama that's absolutely fantastic is he goes through international law, and apparently there's traffic laws on the oceans that apply to battleships. And by, his kind of diagram of the event, an interpretation of what happened, and then reading the law, it certainly seems like the American ship should have had the responsibility to take some kind of change correction course early on to make sure this collision didn't happen. It seems from the video that didn't happen, and then at the last minute, the Russian ship made an evasive action, which is what I guess you're supposed to do, again, by, sea traffic laws that I certainly have never had to go through myself. I really don't understand. However, I, read the source documents that Moon of Alabama provided. And it seems to me that unless, there's something else nefarious going on here, his interpretation that the American ship should have taken evasive action first, it seems to be correct. Now, it may have been that the American ship tried to move a little bit, then the Russian ship moved a little bit to try to create some kind of tension or hostility here. I can't say for sure, but, from what you read, if you read the Moon of Alabama article, it does seem like the American ship was in the wrong here. All right, on to Venezuela. What I want to talk about today is a news story that I'm sure we all saw the headlines of. 4,000 Venezuelans flee the country since crisis. And it's the numbers from the UN. And you say, oh boy, that sounds like a real problem. Things must be really bad in Venezuela. This story gets a ton of shares. It's reprinted absolutely everywhere. And I'm thinking, man, maybe my interpretation of Venezuela isn't quite correct. I mean, I look at the stats online. It says the country is over 30 million people or so. And so 10% of the country leaving in, my thought is 3 or 4 months here because, since the crisis must mean since January when Juan Guaido attempted to become president of the country. Well, you click on the article and then in the first sentence it says that the UN estimates that 400,000 people have fled Venezuela since the start of the crisis, and then 3.3 million of those who have fled Venezuela have fled since 2015. And then I start to scratch my head and say, that is far different than what I thought. Because, I mean, while it's not insignificant that, 3.3 million people have apparently fled Venezuela, which roughly 10% of the country, assuming this number is correct, have fled the country over the past 4 years or so, 4 years and a half now. That's far different than 4 million people leaving the country then. And so this is obvious propaganda. It's not trying to give the people the truth. It's trying to mislead about the nature of the crisis in Venezuela, making it seem bigger than it actually is. Look, I'm a libertarian. I have no doubt that people are leaving Venezuela to flee socialism. That's probably happening. The Americans are certainly making it worse with their sanctions. That probably adds to the fact that there's people fleeing Venezuela to get away from U.S. sanctions. But a good number of people in Venezuela are leaving because of the lack of economic opportunities under the Maduro administration because they're commies. But it's not 4 million people in 6 months. It's 3.3 million people over the course of 4.5 years. Unfortunately, the fake news, kind of hashtag and everything ended up as being a part of the Trump camp because he was taking on fake news outlets like CNN and MSNBC. Who certainly deserve the fake news title. But, now it's been adopted by Trump. It's really unfortunate because these are the kind of misleading problems that ends up with America in war. And then we look back on after and we say, Saddam didn't have weapons of mass destruction. Muammar Gaddafi wasn't going to kill all of his people. What? Assad wasn't using chemical weapons? Yes, all those things because, they run these misleading headlines and stuff like that. Another example is last week I'm reading that Assad is apparently burning all the fields in Syria. Well, it turns out reading in the Washington Post this week, it's a lot more obscure than that. Apparently ISIS is responsible for burning a lot of it and intentionally so. There's some reports that Syrian artillery shells are landing in the middle of fields and setting them on fire. But, this could also be just due to the course of war. You guys are battling around farms, they get set on fire. Also kind of, funny and maybe just something to throw at some obnoxious war hawk. This is what the North Army did during the Civil War. Total war. They burnt the fields. They starved the people. And so equate Lincoln with Assad and see how they feel about that if they're presenting this narrative. But in reality, I'm guessing that most of the intentional fires are caused by the Islamic State. That doesn't mean that some Syrian military unit, just like an American one would go out there and commit some war crimes and set some fields on fire because they're tired of fighting this war. They're tired of fighting against jihadists. The people who own the farm, tend to side with the, Syrian rebel side, even if it's terrorist, over the Assad government. So they think, well, if they side with the terrorists, I'm going to burn down their field. Unfortunately, it has all these other impacts, and it's really going to hurt the people. It's a terrible thing that's happening. I just don't think Assad's responsible for all of it. Last of the misleading news stories I have for today, and this is a great breakdown by Ben Norton. I believe he wrote at the Gray Zone, but may have been published somewhere else. I'll link to it in the show notes page. Anyways, what he does is he goes through and he says, all these media outlets reported that Kim Jong-un's nuclear weapons negotiation team with the U.S. was purged and, I heard reports executed, sent to labor camps. I think I should have been more exact on the show about, a lot of people are reporting they're just sent to the labor camps and not actually executed. A couple days later, the guy's photographed standing right next to Kim Jong-un. And you think, man, the media really got this one wrong. They must really be apologizing, saying that, we didn't mean to smear the North Korean government during this time of sensitive negotiations around trying to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, make it a safer, more peaceful, and prosperous area for all involved, including the North and South Koreans. But nope, they just kind of forget it and move on. All right, news on the S-400 missile system. this is something that I've really been following because it's big to the relationship between the U.S. and Turkey, which is going to be critical in resolving situations around the Middle East, including in Syria, where the U.S. backs the Syrian Kurds, who the Turkish believe are a terrorist group. But with this S-400 missile system deal, it's a very advanced air defense system from Russia. I believe it's equivalent to the U.S. Patriot missile batteries. We got those operating in Saudi Arabia. And Turkey wants to buy this missile system. The U.S. says, well, you can't operate these missile systems, and the 5th generation brand new U.S. stealth aircraft, the F-35, because it'll give a tactical advantage to Russia over the F-35. And I think there's some people who say that the two systems aren't compatible. I don't know what the hell that means. I don't know why you need a missile defense system to fly a plane, but that's kind of what some of the suggestions sound like. What I'm guessing is it means is you just can't operate both at the same time. And maybe you can't operate both off of the same radar system or something like that. But I'm sure it wouldn't be impossible for Turkey to fly a F-35 above the S-400 missile system. Anyways, the U.S. has been demanding for at least a year now that Turkey absolutely does not make this purchase. And occasionally you'll have a report, Turkish official says we're backing down on buying the S-400 missile system, or we're delaying the purchase, but so far Turkey says they're going forward with it. I believe the original kind of idea for delivery was this summer. I had interpreted that to mean sometime, early summer, and I think that's wrong. What Russia's saying now is they're going to deliver the system in 2 months. The Pentagon issued a statement saying that Turkey must reverse its decision to purchase the S-400 missile system by July 31st, or they would lose out on the F-35. And we had the U.S. taking some initial steps of now allowing any more Turkish pilots or maintenance crews into the U.S. to learn about the F-35. This is a high-tech piece of machinery, nothing like what the Turks have in their current Air Force. And so they had to come to the U.S. and train, I believe in Arizona, on F-35s, how to maintain them, how to fly them, all this kind of stuff. And so there's supposed to be a new rotation of Turkish pilots coming in. We're not going to let that happen. It doesn't mean, at least not yet, that we're expelling the Turkish pilots that are here. I believe there's about 26 total in the crew, including the maintenance crew, that are currently living in the U.S. training. It may be till the end of July before the U.S. government says that they have to leave too. So it looks like we maybe have a day that we will figure out exactly what's going to happen here. July 31st, I got it marked on my calendar. It'll be interesting. I'm sure there'll be developments into the lead up of this, but I really think it's important, not just because of the U.S. relationship with Turkey around the S-400 and the F-35. I really don't care. I really don't care if Lockheed gets to sell Turkey a bunch of planes and make a whole bunch of money. What I do care about is how the U.S. relationship with Turkey plays out for the end of the Syrian civil war, the plight of the Kurds, the U.S. relationship, or the Saudi blockade of Qatar, and how Turkey has taken the Qatari side where there's a massive U.S. air base and now a Turkish base, and yet the U.S. still has strong relationship and a lot of military assets and selling a lot of military assets to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who are at odds with Qatar. Talk about impact too. Erdogan possesses a lot of authority in the Middle East, and what he says about how the Palestinians are treated is important. So, there's a lot going on here and a lot that weighs in on this relationship that is currently now struggling because of military sales. The new commander of NATO is no longer, I think it was Breedlove before. This new guy is also the U.S. Eurocom commander. So, yeah, I guess he's serving in dual roles now. But he said that he wasn't concerned about the relationship between the United States, NATO, and the Turkish military. All right, some news on Israel. I'll do good news first. Bernie Sanders came out and made some positive statements on it. Good to see a 2020 candidate doing that. Hopefully we'll see more follow suit. I do think this is an issue that progress can be made on during this election cycle. It seems like Democrat politicians taking the side of the Palestinians would be advantageous with looking at the current Democratic base. And so it could really start to force other people to follow suit on the issue. Look, you're not going to see the Hillary Clinton types be the first to come out and endorse gay marriage. They're not going to do it. They're politicians. They're terrible people. But if you have some good politicians come out and take stands on the issue that people support, it'll follow the rest of them to follow suit. And look, it only took a few years. Now anybody who doesn't agree with her is a bigot on the issue. So they flip-flop fast, and we could have them in our direction on this one maybe sometime soon. All right, on to bad news about Israel. Statement by the U.S. ambassador to Israel. This is a longtime Trump lawyer, and he's been, I believe, working with Jared Kushner on this deal of the century nonsense. And he says it looks like he's giving some green light for Israel to start annexing parts of the West Bank. He says it's likely that Israel will be able to keep some of the West Bank, but unlikely all of it. So the fact that, it's only unlikely all of it's quite the head scratcher, but it seems like they're really going to just Swiss cheese the whole West Bank, and Israel's going to control it all with a few and maybe somewhat independent, autonomous, maybe with their own security force, but probably not just areas of Palestinian until they're all killed or driven off their land. That may sound like an extreme statement, and I'm sure enough of my guests listen to the show know that it's not. But here's quite the example of what I mean by the Israelis driving the Palestinians off their land. We have a 5-year-old girl living in Gaza, and she has cancer. The hospital in Gaza says, we don't really have the technical abilities to handle this kind of treatment, so you need to send her to a Palestinian hospital in East Jerusalem. Family says, okay, this happens in the United States. I've known families that have had to travel or move to get treatment for, their children's cancer or other kind of rare disease. Of course, in the United States, this means that, mom and dad hop on a plane with the kid. Maybe they drive across country. Maybe they pick up their whole family and move. Hell, there's even a charity where, the billionaires let people like this fly on their private planes to go get their medical treatment. I'm sure it's a fun time for the kid to be on these nice fancy jets, especially when you think about this. They're talking about kids with cancer. So, they're going through a traumatic time. A lot of the tests they're going through, I'm sure, while good for the child, are absolutely scary. A lot of the medications make them feel worse, not better. It has to be an absolute traumatic event. But all this happens in the U.S. routine, no problem. In Israel, if you live in Gaza, you have to get a permit from the Israelis to be able to travel to East Jerusalem. Now, they're both Palestinian territories, but you have the big state of Israel in the middle, and they say you can't go from one to the other. Well, you would think in a reasonable society, this is a little bit inconvenient, but no problem. I mean, I go down to the local office, I say, hey, I'm the mother of a 5-year-old with cancer, and they say, what can we do for you? You get permits for everyone. You go and, you have a nice time and you try to get your daughter healthy. No, parents reject it, family members reject it, family friends reject it. It's, I believe, eventually like a friend of a friend that finally gets a permit, so somebody that this little girl hardly even knows, to travel with her to East Jerusalem. How terrifying this must be for this little girl. Think about going with somebody you don't really know. I'm sure all she wants is to be around her family and her mother and her father, but if she stays where she is, she's not going to get the medical treatment she's going to need, and she's going to die. Apparently she goes, the treatment doesn't go well. She's up there for a month. People are applying to meet with her. They're rejected. It's absolutely horrific and terrible. The little girl loses conscience about a week before she passes away, and then she's finally, sent back home. We can't do anything for her, so at least let her be around her family at the end, and then she passed away. So this is what I'm talking about. When I'm talking about, tormenting the Palestinians into leaving, basically, denying them the right to travel as a family to get medical care for this daughter. It's one of the most disgusting things, that could happen to somebody. And, it's so intentional. Somebody could have approved this. Somebody could have made it happen for this little girl, but they chose not to. And I think it's because they want all the Palestinians to leave and give all the territory to the Israelis. And that's just the way it is. All right, the last thing I have on today's show is the, newish CENTCOM commander, General McKenzie, issued this statement on Iran saying that he thinks the threat from Iran is imminent. Now, if you read the rest of his statement, what he probably could have said there is ongoing, and this would be in line with, even the British general's statement saying that, we have our forces next to a whole bunch of Iranian-backed militias, so there are some risks to U.S. forces and assets in the Middle East. That makes sense. Saying the threat is imminent seems to suggest that you're saying that you think sometime in the next week, some Iranian militia is going to set up some kind of trap and kill a whole bunch of American soldiers or something crazy like that. So this is what we have, who we have leading our forces. This is the situation that we're in. That's why it's so important to fight against, the U.S. empire and reject it because there's so many horrible things going on because of it. Try to do my part by making the show. If you can, take the time to share foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org. My website is immersionnews.com. Then check out my Patreon page, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.